Thank you. Good morning. Welcome to our Fall 2024 Grace Adams Tanner Lecture in Human Values, given by Camille T. Dungy. And her topic, as you can see, is Soil, the Story of a Black Mother's Garden, African Diaspora and American Land. I am Dr. Danielle Dabrowski, Director of the Grace A. Tanner Center for Human Values here at Southern Utah University and Professor of Creative Writing. The Grace Adams Tanner Center for Human Values, founded in 1980, promotes human values by advancing cultural understanding, empathy, and social responsibility through critical thinking and dialogue in order to better appreciate the complexities of the human condition. We appreciate the support of the Tanner Foundation that establishes this annual lecture in honor of Grace A. Tanner's legacy at SUU. I would like to thank Paul Ryan of Eccles Apex for overseeing the production of this lecture, and Dean Jean Bereen of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, as well as Interim Provost Shauna Mendini and President Mindy Benson for their continual support of this important lecture, and I appreciate, as always, your attendance as well. The Tanner Lecture on Human Values was formally established at the University of Cambridge, England, in July 1st, 1978. And in writing about the purpose of these lectures, Professor Tanner said, "I see them simply as a search for a better understanding of human behavior and human values." The Grace Adams Tanner grew up in Parowan and was an alumna of Southern Utah University. The Tanner Lectures are a prestigious series of lectures given at such places as Yale, Harvard, Stanford, Cambridge, and Oxford. We are honored at Southern Utah University to have the only lecture named after Grace Tanner. The Grace A. Tanner Lecture is selected each year by an advisory board of faculty in line with Southern Utah University's strategic plan of being people-centered, purpose-driven, and place-empowered. And this year we are focusing on the theme of being place-empowered. So I'll give you just a little background regarding Camille T. Dungy. Camille T. Dungy's essay collection, Soil, the Story of a Black Mother's Garden, was a finalist for the Penn Gene Stein Award and functions at the nexus of nature writing, environmental justice, and prose to encourage the reader to recognize the relationship between the peoples of the African diaspora and the land on which they live, and to understand wherever soil rests beneath their feet is home. I have been teaching Soil, the Story of a Black Mother's Garden this year in my class, Introduction to Human Values. Dungy deftly weaves personal connection to place and familiar history of place to this nation's history of place and displacement. This tapestry is created as Dungy chronicles her experiences of establishing a prairie garden in Fort Collins, Colorado, during the year of the COVID lockdown. Thus, the entire book becomes a garden, using the agrarian practice of biodiversity as a metaphor to challenge a monolithic approach to American history and the land, as well as the many myths associated with American nature writing. And after the lecture, we will have a book signing and reception out in the lobby, so please join us for that. Dungy has also written 4 collections of poetry, including Trophic Cascade, winner of the Colorado Book Award, and the essay collection Guidebook to Relative Strangers, Journeys into Race, Motherhood, and History, a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. She edited Black Nature, 4 Centuries of African-American Nature Poetry, the first anthology to bring African-American environmental poetry to national attention. She is the host of Immaterial, a podcast from the Metropolitan Museum of Art and Magnificent Noise. A university distinguished professor at Colorado State University, Dungy's honors include the Academy of American Poets Fellowship, a Guggenheim Fellowship, an American Book Award, and an honorary doctorate from SUNY New York, ESF, and fellowships with the NEA in both prose and poetry. Please welcome Camille T. Dungy.
For coming inside on this beautiful fall day and to listen to us talk about landscape and the world out there. And thank you, Danielle, for your work, and to the committee who helped decide to bring me here. I'm gonna talk for a little bit. and read you a new essay that I wrote just for you. And then a few poems, and then we're gonna have a short conversation, and then the party can get started. How's that? Pictures. We're a visual world now so much, so I like to sometimes have some pictures just going in the background. It also was part of my thinking when I put together Soil, the collection that Danielle's just described, which is a book-length prose narrative, but also has some poems woven into it and photographic images. I'm so excited to say that the photographic artist I worked with just had her work displayed in the Whitney Biennial. So I wanted visual images there too, because I knew that a lot of people wouldn't know the plants I was describing in the book, and I did not want to lose you to Google. And so I have images of the plant from the garden that my daughter and a friend of ours took, and I have clippings. She made sort of cenotype images of clippings from the actual garden, and those are scattered enough through the book that you can trust that if you don't quite know what I'm talking about, there'll be photographic support. So that's also what this is to do as I'm describing these landscapes that I love. So, onward. My father's father was born in Mississippi in 1898. In his teens, he moved one state east to attend college at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. Then he worked for a time in the hills of West Virginia. But from that time on, he moved forever west, never going back to the south. When people asked him if he ever planned to go back to Mississippi, my grandfather said, "I didn't leave anything there. There's no reason to go back." There's a story in my family that my grandfather always wanted to live in California. From when he was a child there in Mississippi, he wanted to move to California. When he left Tuskegee, it was with the intention of moving to California. But after leaving West Virginia, he stopped in Gary, Indiana to visit family and got caught there like a leaf in an eddy. He opened a tailor shop in Furrier and stayed in the Midwest half a century. In the late 1970s, after my father took a job in Southern California and moved there with his wife and two young girls, my grandfather finally closed his shop and moved close to us in Orange County, California. That's when his sons first learned that this had always been his dream. The years when my grandfather left Mississippi were the early years of the Great Migration. People went north to New York, Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, or west to California. But my granddad didn't make it that far until all those years later. Still, he spent the final years of his life there in California. We buried him there, in the place where some part of him always wanted to be. Sometimes, I wonder if my love of the American West is as deeply genetic longing, a calling so encoded in my DNA I could no more avoid it than I could avoid the shape of my nose or the curve of my fingernail beds. Maybe I have to live here to satisfy some compulsion that goes back further than I can fully conceive. When my father graduated from high school, he enlisted in the Army with, among other reasons, a desire to earn the money to support his college aspirations. At some point, not long after enlisting, he boarded a DC-3 from Fort Sill, Oklahoma, to Tacoma, Washington. The plane stopped to refuel in Pocatello, Idaho, which is in a valley ringed by mountains. That, for a kid from the flat prairies of Illinois, were just amazing. Later, he boarded a troop train that took him across much of the American West from the base near Seattle, Washington, the Great Northern Route, Spokane, Bismarck, into Minneapolis, and then on further to the troop ships in New Jersey. And later still, he boarded another train headed for Washington State. That train partially followed a path along the Columbia River that intersected with the trail of the 1803 Corps of Discovery, the route traced by Lewis and Clark and York and Sacagawea and her baby and the rest of the folks on that expedition. There's a story in my family that says that looking out those train car windows, my father understood that this was a part of the world where he would be happy to live. But those weren't even my father's first trips to the West. In high school, as a Boy Scout, he attended an enormous gathering in Wyoming, a conclave for the Order of the Arrow in Laramie, mid-1950s. My father was the only black boy in his troop, and he had to ride in a segregated train car near where the porters and cooks bunked during their all too brief rests. Those men took good care of my father. They pointed out landmarks and made sure he had adequate food. Looking out that train car window, my father couldn't get over the beauty that went on for mile after mile. And the wildlife too, the pronghorn and deer, the eagles and so on. So different from the Midwestern landscape of central Illinois and Indiana that he'd known his whole life. A lot of people think that the artist Jackson Pollock is famous for doing little more than splashing paint across canvases. But once, visiting Germany, I saw a monumental Pollock piece in a museum in Cologne. Often now, living so close to Wyoming, I drive across the state's wide open expanse, sometimes drifting not far from Cody, where Jackson Pollock spent most of his youth. Oh, I said, standing in Cologne and taking in the gradations of pinks and reds and yellows splashed across Pollock's canvas. That looks just like Wyoming. Maybe Pollock isn't an abstract expressionist at all. Maybe that is, the work's expression isn't actually abstract. Maybe he's a landscape artist, a realist. He's just describing a landscape only some of us are lucky enough to regularly and deeply see and understand. After basic training, Dad shipped out to Germany, late 1950s, 60 years before I visit the country and stand in front of a painting that reminded me of a landscape my father had fallen in love with when he was just 15 or 16 years old. In Germany, my dad was stationed along the edge of the Cold War's Iron Curtain. I want to say he was far, far away from America's deep-seated segregation. But the US military had only been desegregated for less than a decade, and much of the military still bore the marks and machinations of that legacy of cruelty and hate. Dad navigated the complex relationship with his superiors and fellow soldiers while patrolling another catastrophic and arbitrary human divide. Every leave, he traveled the region, learning German, studying the history of the ever-shifting geopolitical terrain, navigating the brutal realities of destruction caused by animosity and war. His tour complete, Dad returned to the States and attended university and then medical school in Illinois. In Chicago, he met and married my mother, 60 years this summer. She and her family had their own histories of movement, always further and further west. He finished medical school and began an internship in surgery and internal medicine at the University of Utah, Salt Lake City. There, the couple took up skiing, heading into the high mountain powder every chance they could. There's a story in my family of my uncle who had taken up skiing in Michigan, where he attended college. He visited my parents and skied Alta one day, then needed 2 days to recover from Utah's demanding yet addictively compelling terrain. After Utah, my parents drove a U-Haul over several mountain passes to their next home in northern Colorado. That's my girl in that picture there. There, my dad did a pediatric residency at Stanford. And that's also where my older sister was born. Sometimes I think of the fact that every egg my mother ever carried had been in her body since she was a fetus in my grandmother's womb. My grandmother also moved further and further west over the course of her life. Maybe I've been washed in this compulsion ever westward since I was nothing but a single cell. Not long after Stanford, a job opportunity took my father, mother, and sister to Denver. That's where I showed up. 1 cell becoming 2, then 4, then 16, then this whole breathing body. I was born in an Oz-like city, plunked onto the prairie with monumental mountains flanking the north and west and southwest. The wind sweeps over Denver from the Great Plains all the way from St. Louis and even further east. Wind that follows the route of the Overland Trail and then stops just a bit west beyond Denver before climbing up and over the Rocky Mountains if it has the gumption and the strength. Eventually, my family followed that wind and drove over the Rockies and also over the Sierra, even further west. We settled for most of my childhood just 8 miles from the Pacific Ocean, about as far west as we could get. The 4 of us at home there, and soon my grandfather too. I don't know what it is about the West. I don't know why it is, maybe I should say, that I need to be here. But I do. I think it has always been so. For years after college, I attended Stanford, returning to the place where my sister was born. But after I graduated, I lived for some time on the eastern seaboard, North Carolina, which, if you are the praying sort, you should be praying for now. The devastation from Helene is horrific in so much of the state. North Carolina, Boston, Virginia. I have a little joke about how I ended up staying there so long. I'd received a 2-year fellowship for graduate school, what I thought could be a 2-year free trial offer of the American South. But I must have written this agreement in Roman numerals and neglected to put crossbars over the top and bottom of the numbers. And whatever powers listened to my prayers misinterpreted the Roman numeral 2 for an 11. And it was over a decade before I was released back to California, where I had wanted to be all along. Am I right? Like, yes? Like, that is, it's not abstract, as it turns out. The whole time I lived in the East, I was like Jackson Pollock, thinking about the West. And I saw the world in comparison to the part of the country I truly called home. The birds are different in the East. The grass is different. The trees are different. So many and so thick and so densely packed. The mountains are shorter. The air is wetter. The sky is smaller. And on and on and on the differences go. I only have one daughter. And I didn't have her until I left the Eastern Seaboard and moved back to California. Within a few months of my return, I met the man I love. 2 years later, we were married. Another 2 years later, we welcomed our daughter. During the final trimester of my pregnancy, I bargained with the fetus, asking her to come at such a time that when we were admitted to the hospital that sat on the top of a hill, we get the corner labor and delivery room. The one with the view of the hilly terrain of San Francisco out one window and the wild Pacific Ocean out the other. A view with the kind of varied beauty I haven't experienced many places outside of the American West. Just want to make sure we're moving forward. I wanted a view like that as I welcomed my child into this world. I wanted from the very beginning to share with her something I so deeply love. She came right on time. We got that room and that view. 3 years later, we moved from California to my own birth state, Colorado, and we're still there. Sometimes I think I should leave. Savvy professionals in this day and age can do better financially and professionally by moving from institution to institution, but I don't know if I will ever be able to leave. This place is my place. Our part of Colorado is prairie running toward the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. Our part of Colorado is sagebrush and chaparral. Our part is green only during the June rains. And even then, our place is a softer, yellower green than the green in a standard box of crayons. Our place is difficult for many outsiders to appreciate. They want trees and more trees. They want lushness and more obvious representations of life. Our place is brown most of the year. The kind of brown you have to live inside long enough to differentiate. Until recently, people often told my husband that he looked like Dr. Ben Carson, even though my husband and Dr. Ben Carson look nothing alike. I came to understand that Ben Carson was the only black man a lot of white people knew or recognized. And so when they saw a black man with an ovalish face and the title doctor in front of his name, they conflated the two, my husband and the now dead TV personality. For a lot of people, the brown in our place plays out something like this. Those brown bodies in the Western landscape are unfamiliar to eyes trained on greens of the East. So all the browns look alike. But not for me. For me, there is tan brown and yellow brown and gray brown and green brown. There's dusty sage that's not brown at all, except for the woody bits that are covered in a light grayish green. There's red and pink and a kind of pink yellow that's verging on a rose gold that is verging, if you lack imagination, on tan. For me, there are all the blues the sky conjures. The gloaming hours dark blue of jewelry box velvet, and the bright, bright blue of a robin's egg in mid-afternoon. For me, there are all the yellows. Rabbit brush, sunflower, coreopsis, sneezeweed, evening primrose. The pinks and light purples of echinacea, bean balm, Nuttall's larkspur. There are the browns you can see from 30,000 feet in an airplane, the unirrigated and less irrigated sections of crop circles, the crisscross grids of ranch roads, the open stretches of blue grama and prairie dog mounds. There's a story in my family of my daughter on a visit to the Green Mountains in Vermont. Early June. The mountains so much smaller than the mountains in our place. Lush, 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 lush with vivid, almost technicolor early summer green. My daughter had just turned 6. She was 112 years younger than my paternal grandfather. Like him, she was ready to leave that side of the country. We were on the way to the airport when I asked her if she was sad to leave Vermont, and my daughter told me she could see no reason to stay. I am so tired, she said, of all of this green. Some hours later, as we began our descent into Denver, my daughter looked out the window of at the wide expanse of Colorado. Brown stretching almost unbroken from the far eastern horizon to the Rockies in the west. Brown fields, brown prairie, brown grass, brown bushes, brown foothills, brown, 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 brown. Ah, my little black girl with skin brown and soft as beautiful, fertile loam said, "That's better." I have a theory about European migration patterns in North America up through the early 20th century. The Spanish went a lot of places on this continent, but they really stuck it out in parts of Texas, New Mexico, Southern California. When I was in high school, I visited Spain and couldn't get over how similar that landscape was to the soft tan rolling hills of my Southern California childhood home. Then, in college, I spent time in England, Scotland, and Ireland, moving next to North Carolina and Virginia, and marveling again at the similarities in topography and flora between those heavily English and Scotch-Irish immigration magnets and those immigrants' island homes. I spent time in the upper Midwest too. It wasn't until I visited Norway and Sweden years later that I learned of the similarities between Michigan and Minnesota's lake and pond-filled boggy landscapes and the Scandinavian homelands of so many of the region's 19th century settlers. When they could choose, people went from Europe to places in North America where they were comfortable, where they knew how to grow things, what to do about the weather. But, of course, not all of us got to choose where we landed in America. I don't even know where on the enormous continent of Africa my people are from. Maybe we're from some part of the savannah that looks remarkably like the American West. Maybe that's why the deep longing and strong connection to this landscape. But the first people who became my people in America had no choice where in this country they lived. Some of them ended up in Virginia, some in Mississippi, whether they liked it or not. I don't know what I can tell you about the experience of the entire African diaspora and American land. But I can tell you part of my story, part of my family's story. From before we could know why, for at least 4 generations, my people have longed for the West. Those people from Virginia, from Mississippi, something in them wanted to move west. I was born here. And so was my sister, my daughter. We are the culmination of a century or more's worth of westward bound dreams. My whole understanding of the world starts here, on this side of the 100th parallel, drinking water from the western side of the Continental Divide. I bought a house, and right away began a garden that prioritized plants that are native to this place. Is a way to welcome the other than human neighbors that are natives of this place as well. My eyes have grown accustomed to and hungry for the minute gradations of color that overwhelm me with gratitude, for the gradations of beauty I see where others see nothing but brown. Despite the long history of Black people in the American West, I know there are a lot of people who think my presence and deep rootedness here are an anomaly, that Black folks in the West are few and far between. The town where I live in northern Colorado was, at the last census, only 1.2% Black. So maybe there's something to this perspective. Part of the work I do in my writing and in my life as a community member and as a professor and a mother and a gardener is strive to broaden people's understandings of what sorts of bodies have a right to live in which landscapes. Who has a right and a welcome to live in this landscape? This is a struggle that has gone on long before me and will, I understand, continue long after my mortal vessel has returned into the beloved red-brown earth. And so it shall be. I can conceive of no other place I want to write out of, and no other place I would rather write into. There is no landscape that welcomes me as completely as the various Western landscapes I love. This is the first poem in my first book, a poem I wrote a long time ago while I was living on the Eastern Seaboard. I came to Utah to visit a friend, walking through the slot canyons near her home in Teasdale, close to Capitol Reef. A day of differentiating all the gradations of brown, looking for rattlers who blend into the background, watching the sky for the subtle changes in blue that signify a coming storm. I came home, tired, happy from all that watching, all that seeing. That day, I wrote this poem about the deep, deep connection between such a landscape, this Western landscape, and everything about my life. Language. Silence is one part of speech. The war cry of wind down a mountain pass, another. A stranger's voice echoing through lonely valleys. A lover's voice rising so close, it's your own tongue. These are keys to cipher. The way the high hawk's key, These are keys to cipher. The way the high hawk's key unlocks the throat of the sky, and the coyote's yip knocks it shut. The way the aspen's bells conform to the breeze, while the rapid's drum defines resistance. Sage speaks with one voice, pinyon with another. Rock, wind her hand and water her brush, spells and then scatters her demands. Some notes tear and pebble our paths. Some notes gather the bank we map our lives around. Now I'm going to read 2 more poems, and then we're going to talk a little bit, and then the party's going to get started. So much of this book, Soil, is about the effort to learn to see this landscape as it is and has been. And how to revel in the diversity of the landscape, which is often complex and complicated and difficult to reintroduce. And sometimes I was like, why? Why? Here's one of the poems in the book, which becomes something of an answer to that question for me. Let grow more winter fat, wine cup, western wild rose. So little open prairie left. Little waves of blue stem, little fuzzy-tongued penstemon. Quieter the golden current, nodding onion, quieter now as well. Only a few clusters of Colorado butterfly plants still yawn into the night. Where there once was prairie, A few remaining fireflies abstract themselves over roads and concrete paths. Prairie wants to stretch full out again and sigh. Purple prairie clover, prairie zinnia, prairie dropseed nodding into solidago. Bee balm brushing rabbit brush. Prairie once, prairie once, prairie once. And now one last poem. Since I read you the first poem of my first book, I thought I would read you a poem from my next book. It's not even out yet. My agent doesn't even have this book yet. Remembering a honeymoon hike near Drakes Bay, California, while I cook our dinner at the feet of Colorado's Front Range. That stretch of coast, like the soft spot in yourself, the heart of yourself I call your soul, that feeling that comes there when fog settles so truly, I know I am walking inside a cloud. Intangible, tangible, both at once. Sweetheart, I need to tell you something after we finish tonight with this dinner I'm preparing. Rainbow, charred, wilted in oil with shallots and pepitas, herb-rubbed chicken already roasting. Even on these hot days, even when I'm far from the cool coast of California we haven't lived near since we moved close to these mountains. When I am with you, I am inside such a cloud. This is how I know I won't ever believe in heaven if heaven isn't right here with you. Our sunflowers keep coming back, year after year after year, since that first year we drove seeds under our new yard's soft soil. That, dear heart, is it. It is the softness I need to thank you for. I'd be lost without that part of you that eases up enough to let me in, and then closes back around me. For years, on the edge of California's coast, ship after European ship sailed past, an inlet kept safe inside a cloud. Safe, the sweet smell of California buckeye and dusty green sage. Safe, the spine flower, checker lily, blue blossom. Unharmed, the little native bees and yellow-faced bumblebees who skip from flower to flower. Unharmed, the coast buckwheat, the fiery skipper and gossamer-winged butterflies who need buckwheat to survive. Unharmed, the lumbering grizzly. Unharmed until thin fog let ships in, the snakes and mountain lions too. You've lived long enough, sweetheart. You've paid attention to your history. You know what some people will do if let in to the part of yourself you spent so long protecting. But you showed me this anchorage, those soft brown shoulders, the headlands. Here I am, so much in bloom, and me with you in all this soft, wild buzzing. Thank you. You're welcome. I'm gonna close that and you're gonna, this is coming up. We're gonna have a, yeah, no, come join me. We're gonna sit. We're gonna see this beautiful window.
thank you again. What if we could just thank
I think you
Camille
need the
one more
mic.
time? Oh, yeah.
It's over there.
Is this working okay now? What if we could just thank Camille one more time for just that wonderful lecture and the poetry and bringing all of that? Thank you again so much. Thank you. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you.
And I wanted to start off with a question that I didn't plan, but as you were reading your work, I'm going to start off with a poet's question. Then we'll go into another just question about place, because they are related. Because the way that you help us see your place, you're helping us, you talk so much about seeing, and I wonder if you could talk about what it means to see through language. Because that is what poets, what writers, we do that, we see through language. I wonder what would you say to just, how would we expand our own way of seeing, just with that concept of seeing through language or other ways of which you're able to see so much of the natural world, the landscape, and all of that.
Yeah. You know, people ask me sometimes, like, when did I realize I wanted to be a writer? And I feel like there are three moments. Like, one is that I always thought I was going to be a writer, like from when I was a little kid. Like even before I really had language or written language, I would like write stories and then tell them. And then I went to college thinking I was going to be in the pre-med program, like a third of all kids who go to college do. And I was taking molecular biology and organic chemistry and reading and writing poetry, and guess which of those three classes was getting the bulk of my attention? And I sort of realized that probably I should follow where my attention and care was and not like fail out of organic chemistry and molecular biology, so I changed my courses so that I could become an English and creative writing major, and you know, maybe that was the one time where it stuck, but then I got that 2-year free trial offer at the American South. And I was walking around Greensboro, North Carolina, and I was so deeply confused. Like, it was just like, what is happening? Like, I don't know how to describe these trees. The sky is weird. It's so different, right? It's like, it's smaller. It's just smaller. And I couldn't figure it out. And then I realized I remember it was a sunset, and I was literally walking over a bridge, not just metaphorically. I was actually walking over a bridge at sunset as a new, like a moving into a new day possibility, and I thought, oh, I'm in graduate school to be a writer, and it's my job to figure out how to describe what's different, how to describe this landscape in comparison to what I know, so that I can help explain. So I think from the very beginning for me, what it meant to be a writer, and I was in graduate school for poetry, meant figuring out how to describe the landscape and how to describe the sky and space and plants and things. So it's just always been part of the focus of my study and care.
Thank you. And as you're talking again, I'm thinking, I had the opposite experience of growing up in Virginia and then moving to southern Utah. And so it was a similar experience of like, where's my humidity? Where's my air? Where's the envelope to hug me as opposed to the open sky? And then beginning to learn how to write about that place. So I love that. And Simon Schama writes in his book, Landscape and Memory, about how landscape shapes us and we shape landscape in our minds and our memory. There's this sort of dual relationship between our memory of landscape and how it shapes our perceptions as well. And so your work has reminded me of that. So this is a question now that I wanted to kind of look at more in terms of notions of place, how we engage with place, both historically and through our myths. You write in your book, very significantly, you say, we must live honestly inside our history. So there's two questions. Why do you think that is so difficult to do? Why? I mean, this is a loaded question, but why is it difficult to live honestly inside our history? Especially, there are myths of the West that we are up against often, and so why is it important, or how can we kind of use that concept of living honestly within our history to maybe push against a lens of myth that may not be accurate for the place? It's a very, again, big question.
Yeah, no, it's a big question. And that statement comes at a point where I was thinking about what was absent from my daughter's elementary school social science and history curriculum. And a large part of what was absent about that was the story of Indigenous people in the landscape that she was learning to celebrate, but she was learning to celebrate it with like minus 15,000 years of cultural history, and then a good 100 years of really violent cultural history, right? And that seemed like a problem for her to, for her education to be absenting those realities, and for a sort of cultural desire for those kinds of erasures, that rather than sit in the discomfort of those 150 years of brutal Western expansion history, to just pretend like people just popped up here and everything was hunky-dory and it was like ours, like and it was just meant to be. So that when I write about my love of the American West, I can't do it without also writing about the very complicated reality of Indigenous history and the strange interweavings of Black American stories with that story, and what it means to own land in a place that once was, for so long, had another story, right? And so I don't think that I don't think I can honestly, as you say, or realistically, or as you quoted me saying actually, or realistically, or also productively talk about how we live on the landscape, because so much of what we need now in terms of how to build a sustainable path forward on this land that we all love has to take into account the realities of this complex and often unattractive stories of ourselves. But also, not just that, there's like a lot of information and knowledge and plants and animals and water use ideas and even like building possibility, right? There's like knowledge that we could be tapping into if we weren't trying to erase so much, that could also help us live better, longer in this space. And so that's important to me as well. And I just want I want my writing to be part of that welcome, as I say a lot, to a more expansive, more inclusive understanding of who we are and where we are and how we've gotten here.
Thank you. I love that idea of the welcoming notion, but also the idea that as a writer, you are compelled to include that history. It just doesn't feel right not to do that. And I think about the poet Seamus Heaney, who grew up in Ireland, and he talks about that if half of his family was Northern, other was Protestant, was Catholic Protestant, and he felt as a writer that he should present his own. He wasn't there just to present the mirror of the community; it was to present the complexities of the community. And so I appreciate you bringing that up to the forefront. So the last kind of question that I have is one that has more to do with maybe how landscapes have shaped your memory, or how they have shaped you, the different landscapes you've lived in, and maybe just in general terms, that concept of feeling that a landscape has shaped you. And that's a broader perspective. So you've brought us to these very beautiful zoomed focus imagery through your work. But then there's also this sense that you carry with you a broader sense of connection to that landscape. So I just wonder what that means for you, that question of how does a landscape shape you or your memory?
Wow.
Yeah, in like what, 3 minutes or less?
No pressure.
Well, I'll say one thing. I mean, I shared that poem, Language, which was the first poem in my first book. And I read that poem once on a panel for a like environmental writers panel. And after reading that poem, an acquisitions editor came up to me and said, I never thought about Black people writing about the natural world. Do you think you can come up with more writers who do that? And I could. This is a short answer to the question, and I ended up publishing an anthology called Black Nature, 4 centuries of African-American nature poetry, which goes all the way back to Phil Sweetley, the first Black person to publish a book in the English language, right? And have spent the rest of my career essentially talking about why it is that so many Black writers have been erased from the Western environmental literature canon, which has a lot to do with the last question that you asked me, and ideas about who really belongs talking about this, enjoying and talking about these landscapes. But for me, it was never a question. It's like the way and the place where I spent my young years, the years when my neural pathways were developing, were in places that were so deeply connected, very much like here. Like, you can't just walk down your main street and not be confronted by that ridiculous mountain thing there, right? Like you can't just like be here and not be like, also there's a greater than human world exactly present in my daily life on the main commercial corridor, right? Same, right? I think that that's one of the things about the West. Like, we are like regularly confronted with this intersection between the living world and the made human world. And so my writing just always had absorbed that. And my mission then became more like talking about why that was normal and why many people did that, and why this kind of Western way of thinking might be different than New York, where the publishing core is, why like people in New York talking about Jackson Pollock are never gonna say, that's a Wyoming landscape. And like, I just am like immediately like, huh, look at that. I know that landscape, right? I just think that for me, that became part of the sort of professor, editor, lecture component of my life, but in the writing, it was just like, this is just who I am, how I see, how I talk. And maybe it became a mission just to be like, I'm not weird. I just, this is language as I understand it. And so much of, here's another return to sort of why it's important, I think, to incorporate indigenous American history. Is like, it is my understanding that several Western indigenous cultures, like language, landscape, history, storytelling, are all intricately connected. Like, you can't tell a story without talking about a landmark in a landscape, right? That landmark in the landscape is the story itself. And maybe that's just because that's how it is here, right? And so that just shows up in my writing, and I've just decided to, rather than push away from it, push into it and interrogate it directly.
Thank you. That is. I think that's excellent. Thank you so much. I appreciate what you have brought to us with the work, and several of Camille's books are available out at the book table. And again, thank you again for coming here to Southern Utah University. We're just so excited to have you here.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.